Good morning, everyone. Amber here. Today I am reading the chapter 6 from what was the Battle of Gettysburg. And the chapter 6 is called Day 3, Pickett's Charge. You guys all ready to figure out what's going to happen? I think we already know from history and everything, but you never know. It's kind of fun to read. Alright. For the exhausted rebel troops, there was good news. General George Pickett, along with his 5,400 soldiers from Virginia, arrived late on the evening of July 2nd. They were the last to arrive at Gettysburg. Pickett's men had not fought at all yet. Lee combined them with parts of 2 other divisions. Still, the total number was only 12,500 soldiers instead of 15,000 that Lee had planned. So this is General Pickett, a picture of him, before I read on. Lee had 160 cannons, I can speak, facing the Union lines. They would bombard and knock out the enemy cannons. Doing this would inflict heavy losses on the Northern soldiers. Then the rebels would charge a small grove of trees. Lee believed this was the weakest point of the Union line. If successful, this charge would split the Union line in half. At 1 o'clock, all 160 Southern cannons fired at once. The noise was so loud that it was heard 40 miles away in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Yikes. That's how loud, 40 miles away, and you could still hear that? I don't know what I would think, what's going on. Possibly that I'm gonna die because it's so loud. Maybe it's a bomb. I don't know. What do you guys think? Union cannons answered back. Soon the entire battlefield was covered in thick white smoke from the cannons. Neither side could see the other. Artillery crews, the soldiers working the cannons, could not aim properly. Most of the Confederate cannons were missing their targets completely. The rebels did not know that. On the Union side, Brigadier General Henry Hunt was in command of the artillery. Hunt was experienced and smart. After the first hour of steady bombardment, he ordered his men to cease firing. Some cannons were moved back out of sight. He wanted to fool the rebels into thinking that all the Union cannons had been knocked out. The trick worked. I like that thought, huh? See, that was pretty smart. Making them think that what they did really worked, and yet it didn't. When the fire from Union cannons stopped, the Confederates believed the enemy cannons were all destroyed. Still, the Southern bombardment went on for another hour until they were almost out of ammunition. That was stupid on their part too, huh? A Southern artillery officer sent a note to General George Pickett. The 18 enemy guns have been driven off. Oh, here's the cannon. Ooh. Sorry, picture. Guessing those must be the Confederates right there blowing them off. For God's sake, come quick, or we cannot support you. Ammunition nearly out. Pickett found Longstreet. General, shall I advance? He asked. Longstreet did not answer. He merely bowed his head. Pickett took this as a yes. I shall lead my division forward, Pickett told him. The Confederate troops began their advance. The 12,500 men had to cross 3/4 of a mile of open fields in the heat. The Union cannons waited for the rebels to get into close range. Union soldiers crouched behind a stone wall, ready with their rifles loaded. The Union general, Winfield Scott Hancock, had only 6,000 men left of the 12,000 he had come with him to Gettysburg 2 days earlier. He watched the rebels advance. The flags of each regiment led the way. Pickett's charge! Their lines were formed with a precision and steadiness. Hancock recalled later. He admired that. Onward the rebels marched. On Seminary Ridge, Lee sat on his horse, Traveler. He could see his men getting closer and closer to the Union lines. Suddenly, the Union artillery opened fire. Within 2 or 3 minutes, hundreds of Confederates were killed or wounded. Still, Confederate officers urged their troops forward. Then the Northern artillery began firing canister shots from their cannons. Canister shots were tin projectiles. I think bullets were bad, but oof, that sounds not good either. Either of it is, I guess, because it's war. Each one contained, we don't even know what it contained, let's see. Hundreds of 1.5-inch iron balls. The canisters came apart in the air, and iron balls spread out like shotgun blasts. Pickett's soldiers were blown to bits. When what remained of the Confederate infantry was only 100 yards away, the Union soldiers suddenly stood and fired a volley straight into them. The whole front rank of Confederates was wiped out. Union riflemen targeted the Confederate officers. All but one were killed or wounded before they ever reached the enemy line. General Hancock was riding behind the Union line, observing the action. All of a sudden, a bullet went through the top of his saddle and into his thigh. The wound was a severe one. Hancock was not expected to survive. The hooks at each end of the long Union battle line swung out so Northern soldiers faced the flanks of the rebel troops. Now the Confederates were being shot at from 3 sides. General Lewis Armistead was the only Confederate officer to reach the stone wall that marked the Union line. He was rushing forward with his sword out. Some of his men had just burst through the enemy line when Armistead was shot. Seconds later, he was captured. Sounds awful. I would not want to be part of a war. Ugh, sounds not. Ugh. I know it's not fun, but it just sounds awful. That's what I was going to try and say. Armistead knew he was dying. Before the war, Armistead and Hancock had served together and became close friends. When the Southern states seceded, the two men found themselves on opposite sides of the war. Nevertheless, they agreed not to let that ruin their friendship. Now Armistead asked a Union officer to give his pocket watch, spurs, and other personal items to General Hancock. The officer told him that Hancock had been seriously wounded. It was uncertain whether he would survive either. Tell General Hancock, I have done him and done you all an injury, which I shall regret the longest day I live, Armistead said. He died 2 days later in a field hospital. Hancock was luckier. He survived the war and later returned his friend's possessions to the Armistead family. The spot where Armistead was shot is marked with a stone monument. Besides honoring Armistead's bravery, the monument is at the high water mark the Confederate attack at Gettysburg. Pickett's charge, as it is called, was the Confederacy's last chance to defeat the Union and win the war, and it was a disaster. The rebels were retreating as quickly as they could. Many were wounded and had to be helped off the battlefield. Many more were too weak to move. Hundreds of bodies littered the battleground. As General Pickett and his retreating soldiers drew closer to their own line, they saw a familiar, gray-bearded figure sitting on his gray horse. It was General Lee. He told Pickett to prepare his troops for a counterattack. General Pickett had just watched Union canyons mow down nearly all his men. General, Pickett told Lee, I have no division. Some stories say that Lee went up to survivors of the charge and said, all this has been my fault. But Lee never mentions this in books he wrote about the Civil War. At the end of the day, each army was holding almost the same position it had when the sun had risen that morning, and nearly 10,000 more soldiers were dead. The day had been very costly for the Confederates. Their losses numbered over 7,000 men. By comparison, the Union Army had lost around 3,000. 3,000 men. So the tombstone reads, Brigadier General Lewis Armistead, USA, fell here July 3rd, 1863. In Gettysburg, any place with a roof and room for wounded men became a temporary hospital. The townspeople helped in any way they could. Union doctors worked around the clock to save lives. Wounded Union and Confederate soldiers lay together. Lee and Meade spent the evening meeting with their officers, going over supplies and figuring out how many troops were still able to fight. Each commander tried to guess his opponent's next move. Lee was expecting Meade to counterattack. Lee's plan for a decisive victory in Gettysburg had not worked. That must be one of the hospitals where men are being treated. Now Lee was going to do what General Longstreet had advised all along. The Southern Army, what was left of it, would head back south. General Meade of the North knew that General Lee was a tough fighter who did not like to give up, but still Meade expected that Lee and his men would retreat, so Meade did not plan for a counterattack the next day. All right, that is the end of chapter 6. So I'll come back for chapter 7. And I hope you guys all have a great day. See you later.